All right, so joining us up here, we have Mike Wilson. He is a software engineer with 16 years of experience, and he's been at Teleport for the past year, improving our app access. Take it away, Mike.
Alrighty, hello. Okay, so today I'm going to give a talk about protecting Okta applications and groups using Teleport. Before we begin, there we go. A little bit about myself. As was mentioned, I am a software engineer. I've got about 16 years of software engineering experience. I'm getting old enough to the point where every time I think about that number, I have to count again and try to remember exactly what that is. I've been at Teleport for about a year. Prior to Teleport, a lot of my focus has been on cloud and infrastructure development. So I've had a lot of experience with AWS, GCP, Azure, Kubernetes, a few other things. If you see me around the conference, please feel free to talk to me. However, I will caution you that if you do talk to me, I will talk your ear off if you let me. So just be prepared. Protecting Okta applications and user groups is done via the new Okta service. So what exactly is the Okta service and what does it do? So it does a few things here. It, for one, mirrors an Okta account or an Okta organization's applications and user groups into Teleport. When this is done, these can then be referenced in our application access service. So when you go to the UI and list applications, you'll be able to see Okta applications that you have access to, as well as access requests, so you can request access to Okta applications and Okta user groups. And I'll get into a little bit more detail about kind of what that workflow, that flow looks like in a moment. It also, and this is sort of I would say a high-level summary, but this also, the service also mirrors Teleport's permission model into Okta. So the idea is that if you have access to something, an Okta application or an Okta user group within Teleport, that access and permission should be mirrored within Okta itself. Okay? So why make something like this? Teleport having its own Okta service allows Teleport users to extend their protections to all apps and groups owned by Okta. So, I think Teleport is increasingly, let me backpedal a bit. Teleport, I think, has a very good story for protecting its own applications and granting its own permissions via its own roles. But Okta has, a massive market share. We use Okta within Teleport, and being able to protect applications at the Okta level and grant access to user groups at the Okta level, I think will be very handy for our customer base and for various users of Teleport, including ourselves. So what exactly does this do? So mentioned before that the Okta service synchronizes applications and user groups into Teleport. At the moment, this happens every 10 minutes. So every 10 minutes, the Okta service goes and polls the Okta API and tries to grab all of the various applications and user groups that Okta currently knows about. During each run of the synchronization process, we use a new Teleport primitive called Okta import rules, which are used to match against the various applications and user groups and apply labels to these, which can then be used by our roles within Teleport to kind of determine whether or not users have access to these applications and user groups. This is kind of a high-level view of our synchronization process, but effectively we retrieve Okta apps, Okta groups, we iterate over each, of those objects and try to match them against our Okta import rules. Okta import rules, currently they can use the actual Okta user group and application IDs for matching, which is a little bit unintuitive because the IDs are kind of a mishmash of numbers and letters, or you can use regexes, which I think is a little bit more intuitive for most, but both are available for use. Then these are stored in the teleport backend for later referencing. So I mentioned that if you have permission to access an application or user group within teleport, that permission is granted within Okta. So at present, that permission is determined at login time, with a slight caveat. But when you log into teleport, we run a process to determine what Okta applications and user groups you're currently granted. And when we determine that, we create an Okta assignment, which contains effectively what assignments in terms of applications and user groups should be made on the Okta side. So as an example, if I were to log in to teleport and I was just recently granted access to an Okta application within teleport, on login, this assignment would be created and then processed by the Okta service, which would then say, oh, Mike has access to Okta application ServiceNow or Salesforce. And then via the API, I would be granted explicit access to that application. Additionally, the same goes for user groups. The caveat about access being determined on login time is access requests. So using the existing access request functionality built into Teleport, you can ask for and receive temporary access to applications and user groups within Okta. So if you're not familiar with access requests today, these are typically short-lived, I believe up to about 24 hours. Though the length of time of the access is configurable to a degree. But once an access request is created, it can then be approved, in which case, via the Okta API, this access will be granted until the access request expires. When that request expires, the Okta API will be used by the Okta service to kind of clean all those assignments up. So this is definitely handy for people that may need temporarily elevated access to services within Okta, something that Okta doesn't necessarily support today. And this is kind of a big value add, I think, for what Teleport kind of gives to Okta. Additionally, in Teleport Cloud, we currently support enabling the Okta service via one of our hosted plugins. So you can run the Okta service as its own service, like you would set up any other service within Teleport, or you can use this plugin. And this will eliminate the need to do a lot of your own heavy lifting when it comes to setting up this service. You'll need your organization URL in order to configure this, and you'll also need an API token. On goteleport.com, we have docs that describe kind of how to set this up and how to do this. Kind of want to go over briefly, a technical overview of the Okta service and the kinds of things that it does. The general architecture of the Okta service is that we've got bits of it kind of hanging out in its own independent service, and then bits of it hanging out within our auth service layer. And the reason for this is interesting. I'll get into that when I go into some of the technical challenges here. But we've got basically this heavy notion of reconciliation. So you'll see that we have this access request reconciler. This is a process that looks for access requests and then creates corresponding Okta assignments for the Okta service to then operate on. Additionally, the Okta assignment processor reconciles Okta assignments against the Okta API. There's a lot of looking and making sure that both Teleport and Okta are kind of in sync with one another when it comes to their current state. So, as I mentioned, Okta assignments are used to calculate what assignments what assignment should be made within the Okta API. This is done on demand, so when an Okta assignment is created, the Okta service will monitor for these and then take action immediately, but every 5 minutes, these are also reconciled. So we'll check against the Okta API to make sure that nothing has gone kind of out of sync. So if you are deciding to manage permissions using Teleport, Okta permissions using Teleport, you go and make a manual change to the user group assignments or application assignments within Okta, Teleport will go and reconcile that as appropriate. This is done primarily to help make Teleport kind of the a central authority for how permissions in Okta are determined. Some of the technical challenges that we ran into, and there's a few more than I have listed here. The Okta service, I believe, was the first enterprise-only service. So there's a lot of Teleport has a lot of services today, but a lot of the enterprise functionality kind of added into the existing services. So the Okta service being the first enterprise-only service meant that we had to lift a lot of the various components that were in the open source offering and kind of expand them to support enterprise. This wasn't, awfully time consuming, but it definitely created a few issues where I was trying to figure out what exactly I needed to lift and shift out of there. Another thing that's kind of worth mentioning here is that access requests themselves are a challenge. They're handled in a special way compared to a lot of the other Teleport resources, which necessitated having services that run specifically on the auth server. But I'd say the central challenge here is Okta's rate limiting. So, I kind of assumed that 16 years into my career, I would know how to handle Okta rate limiting, or just API rate limiting fairly well. But Okta's rate limiting is fairly aggressive. API rate limits are per org, per endpoint, per minute. So any Okta organization, if you're hitting a particular endpoint from one service, that takes up the resources that another service could use. And it makes things very difficult to navigate. Additionally, different API endpoints have different rate limits, and they can range from 40 per minute up to 1,000 per minute. And then additionally, singular endpoints are limited to 4 hits per second. I believe that's right. This makes it fairly challenging when you're attempting to query information about each application or each user group. A few other things is that setting up a scale Okta environment for testing is fairly difficult. When you set up a development environment for Okta, you're only limited to about, I think, 10 apps or so, and a handful of user groups. Whereas, I looked up kind of the average size of a large Okta organization, and I believe there's like 2,000 users and hundreds of applications. So in a development Okta environment, it's basically impossible to replicate this. So this is definitely something that my colleague Warren back there has has helped me get through, because it's very difficult to see all this stuff outside of an actual production environment. So I realize I kind of rolled through this presentation pretty quickly. I've got a ton of time for questions. I'd love to have any questions, thoughts, anything that anybody might want to ask me about this service.
I'm sure I'm not the first one to ask, but is there any plans for something similar for Azure AD?
At present, I'm not aware of any. But that, as I'm sure, my colleagues have put better than me, it's definitely worth getting in contact with us and trying to, get it put on the roadmap.
I had a couple of questions. First one is,
Sure.
how did you overcome the API challenge?
So there's a few ways that we did it. One is that we so the Okta Go client, which is what we use under the covers, it has a fairly good back-off logic built into it. The Okta API itself provides a number of headers that kind of describe how much capacity is left for that particular endpoint. And the Okta Go SDK, or the Okta Go client, will respect those pretty well. One issue that we did have is that we originally had this, specifically for the Okta plugin, if you had multiple auth servers, multiple Okta services would be generated for that plugin, which appeared to be kind of too much for the Okta API rate limits. So we added in a feature to basically kind of like how Kubernetes does with its various control plane services. Only one can kind of be active at a time, and if one gets kind of a lock, if one Okta service gets a lock, that'll be the one that functions, because having multiple of these services running simultaneously seems to overwhelm the rate limiting.
Thank you. Can you set up enforcement so that if someone adds someone to the Okta group replication without teleport process, like identify that, kick that person out or something like that? Okay.
Yeah, so it'll do that today.
Hi. So I was just kind of curious, if I open up an Okta app from like the teleport UI, is that access going to go through the teleport proxy, or am I going to hit the app directly?
So it'll redirect you using the regular, like, Okta redirection pathways. I think there was some brief consideration of trying to get it behind Okta's or Teleport's proxy, but because there's so much of Okta's auth flow in there, we thought it would be too disruptive.
Yeah, it makes sense. And then, so with access requests, so I guess if you request access to an app that's coming from Okta, do you have to access that like from the teleport dashboard, or you just have Okta access to that after?
You'll have Okta access to it after. So I think the intended flow is probably to access it through the teleport dashboard, but there's nothing that prevents you from logging into Okta directly and then hitting the app directly, just by the nature of how Okta works.
Cool, thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm not that familiar with how they implement it. Our IT have originally access to our AWS through Okta, and then since we have teleport, we disable that tile, and then just we need to go to the teleport. Is this thing combine that?
So you're talking about using Okta as an identity provider for AWS?
Right.
So this wouldn't necessarily replace that. However, there is a SAML identity provider within Teleport that you could use for AWS that way. So you can configure Teleport as a identity provider in that instance. So you could potentially use Teleport to, not via the Okta service, but via another mechanism.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay.
Thank you, Mike.